everyone. Welcome to the final program on this stage at the American Writers Festival. My name is Noelle, and I'm the Education Program Coordinator at the American Writers Museum. Thank you all for joining us today and for valuing the past, present, and future of American writing. Writing about the misdeeds and monstrosities of the real world is a task that requires determination and sensitivity. Our next featured writers tackle the crimes of the past and present as investigative reporters seeking truth and justice. Shawn Cohen, author of College Girl Missing, has 28 years of frontline experience covering everything from small-town murders and police corruption to Hurricane Katrina and mass shootings. Philip Isle is an award-winning freelance journalist based in his hometown, Providence, Rhode Island. He is the former news editor of the alt-weekly newspaper, the Providence Phoenix. His first book is Prescription for Pain: How a Once Promising Doctor Became the Pill Mill Killer. They'll be interviewed by Evan Moore, a Chicago-based writer whose work over time consists of topics at the intersection of sports, race, entertainment, news, and culture. Welcome to you all.
Hi everyone, how's it going? Everyone can hear me? Yeah. All right, cool. All right. So, obviously beforehand, I wanted to tell them that I've read their books, because sometimes you can see articles and things written, and then someone can often tell right away when someone has an interview and they haven't read your book. So that's why I let them know from jump when we met, like, hey, I've read your books. Cool. All right. So,
Thank you for that.
No problem. So, that's ground rules here. I'm just gonna have some questions for obviously for both of them individually, but also both they can answer. And so I guess we'll just get started here. And because most people, when they find out someone has written a book, or they try to ask them like, what's the book process like, or how would go through interviews, things of that nature, so on and so forth. So it's something both of you can answer, and tell us here about the book writing process, and also why you decided to go with these particular stories in general, and what was it like to write the book, to go to different places and had to interview all these folks and get everything kind of together, because most people don't see how the sausage is made, they just see books.
You want to start?
Sure. So when that intro was written, that was a few years ago. That I have over 30 years now, and it was about just a quick briefing on what the book is, because it hasn't come out yet. It comes out officially in about a week and a half, May 28th. And it's about the disappearance of a college student named Lauren Spear from Indiana University in 2011. And I was back then working for the Journal News in Westchester, New York, and that's where the girl was from. And so I had covered the case then, and I went to Indiana and was probably more aggressive than most reporters, and drummed up a lot of exclusive information about what happened that night, just kind of the very basics of what happened that night, and the last people she was with, and confronted them. And then the case kind of went cold, and she was never found, and there were no answers. So a few years later, between jobs, I had an opportunity to have freedom essentially to work at one story full time, and that was the one case that really was a part of me, because I had gotten to know her family, and there was just a lot to her story that had not been told. So I met up with the family, and they were they hadn't spoken in quite a while, and they agreed to let me in and start speaking with them in a real serious manner. And they also had private investigators who had worked the case for the years. So they agreed to let me into their essentially shadow investigation of the case. So I took that and I read through that, and it just kind of gave me a good starting point to actually work on a book. And it was more than just writing a book. It was like somewhat of a mission to bring the case back into the spotlight. And I think my attachment to the family made it really emotional for me, and it gave me a great sense of responsibility. So as far as the process goes, I mean, I could go on, but you know, as I gathered information and I had certain strategies that I went about in my reporting and like talking with the people who were, you know, say her roommates and closest friends, and then really honing in on some of the very last people to see her, and giving them motivation to want to or need to talk, you know, finally, because they had hid behind lawyers for all these years. So then it became you know, at what point do you decide to sit down and write the book? And that process was, you know, just lots of conversations and understanding how you bring somebody into one case that people really don't know much about. Maybe they'd read some stories, but how to make people actually care. You know, it's one story, it's one person. It's not like you know her. Why should we care? That's like another question to answer.
Gotcha.
So this book, Prescription for Pain, which came out last month, was 15 years in the making. I didn't spend every day on it, but I first learned in 2009, within about a year of having started in journalism. I was 23 years old, and I learned that my dad, who is a mild-mannered, by all accounts, law-abiding endocrinologist who sings in civic choirs in his free time, knew a guy, a former classmate of his from the University of Chicago, who at the time was under a federal indictment for a massive prescription drug dealing scheme. Prosecutors alleged that he, for nearly 3 years, had been writing just an enormous amount of scripts for opiates, tranquilizers, muscle relaxers, out of cash-only pain clinics in southern Ohio where there were armed guards. Just really sketchy situation, and prosecutors further alleged that a number of patients, over 12 of his patients, had died from apparent overdoses. And so I really didn't have much experience at the time. I had a few clips from my local newspapers. I had an internship the summer before, but I had a lot of ambition and energy, perhaps foolishly, to think, having recently read In Cold Blood, oh, this sounds like an amazing story. So from pretty much the first moment that I learned the facts of the case, and I've been explaining because I'm in Chicago, that one of the few facts I knew to start, my dad had fallen out of touch with this guy, Paul Volkman. He couldn't account for what had happened to him after graduate school, but he knew that he had been arrested after his indictment at his apartment on North Lake Shore Drive, just across from Belmont Harbor. And so that image of this guy being arrested at this really posh apartment building for crimes committed in a down and out part of Ohio, and kind of where the Rust Belt and Appalachia meet, it was immediately fascinating. And even though I put the project down for times, I went to graduate school, I moved home to Rhode Island, I worked at an all-weekly newspaper, I built a name for myself as a freelancer. I never could really shake this story. Just to touch on the process a little bit, Shawn was talking about kind of gaining the trust of the family. In my case, I had access pretty early on to the perpetrator, to Paul Volkman, who still maintains his innocence and has maintained his innocence for as long as I know him, even though he's now serving 4 consecutive life terms in prison. And I sent him a letter a couple months after hearing about his case, explaining who I was, and said, would you be up for speaking to me? And he called me and said, yes, he would be up for speaking to me. The one condition was that I suspend everything I believed about the US government, to which I said, yeah, sure. So I drove out to Chicago later that year, and in December of 2009, with my tape recorder in hand and with his permission, he told me his life story pretty much, and I returned the following summer. So Paul Volkman is the main source for this book. However, surprise, surprise, he's not the most reliable narrator. And so the bulk of the book is including what he says about various times, not just about his criminal activities, but also malpractice cases from early in his career that kind of led him to the desperate place he was in. But it was, in many ways, this book is one long fact check of what Paul Volckmann says happened. And it turns out in many places, but especially down in this town of Southern Ohio, part of Southern Ohio, which happens to be one of the places worst hit by the opiate epidemic, people have a very different version of what he did and the effects of what he did than his claims of being a courageous and compassionate doctor who was ministering to people who had been cast aside by the medical system. And I'll just add one more thing. Because of Volckmann's kind of arrogance and ego, he refused a plea deal. Most federal defendants, when the federal government charges you with crimes, the federal government wins the overwhelming majority of cases they bring. Most people take a plea deal in exchange for a lower sentence. Volckmann didn't do that, so his case went to trial for about 8 weeks in Cincinnati in 2011. The government called 70 witnesses, the defense called 10. So there was wound up being this enormous resource, this 4,000-page transcript and thousands of pages of evidence that I gained access to that make up a large part of the book. So that was a big part of the process, just getting my hands on that stuff.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, when I first read Shawn's book, honestly, you don't want to be one of those people that's like, as the father of a daughter, and people invoke that to try to skirt around real issues, and most people know me from sports or whatever, but one of my first stories was writing about a missing girl, and as in here in Chicago and other places, typically young black girls and women don't get the same energy, and what happened with that was, as in Shawn's book, the family, many conversations with the police, and it got to the point where a private investigator was hired, and private investigator, I guess the person read my story about the missing person and told the private investigator, so that person was found. But at any rate, so with Shawn, with your book, what was those conversations like once you got in with the family and got to speak to them about what you were doing? And what were those conversations like where you spoke with the family, you finally got in there and explained to them, hey, this is what I'm trying to write, and any information you can give or anything like that?
Yeah, so Robert and Charlene Spear are Lauren's parents, and when I first met them on the streets of Bloomington, when they were just living their absolute worst nightmare. She goes out at night and nobody knows where she is in the morning. So they rushed into town, and I was going out there as kind of hard-nosed reporter, finding out things about her night and the fact that she went out with a guy who wasn't her boyfriend, and that there were a lot of drugs in play. It was painful for the family, and they shouted me down. They thought it was essentially like victim blaming to bring out some of the details of her night. So it was only like maybe story after story that I did. It's like, okay, I get a video access to a video that shows her stumbling out of her apartment with this one guy that she went out with. They threatened, they called my bosses and were absolutely furious. And at the 1 year mark, I did a story that was more detailed, and they threatened a lawsuit. So it was only with time as they realized that keeping those details to themselves and what ultimately they're private investigators, that their daughter was still missing, and they were still trapped in this night as they tried to move forward with their own lives. So I think with time I touched base with them, and actually we started to really warm up to each other, and it gradually over the years became a point where they felt like family to me. We grew up like miles from each other. I kind of understood a lot of the family dynamics, and I don't know. It got to the point where she's calling me up, asking me how I'm doing, and when I had kids, she knitted a blanket for my baby son, and you know, when I approached them, like 5 years ago, this was before I had kids, you know, I kind of went at that approach of nobody's really told the full story of what happened that night. They had sued these persons of interest, the last people to see her, and failed in their lawsuit. And there was really just kind of two-dimensional reporting in the early going. So the idea was not just to do another anniversary piece, but to you know, do something that absolutely got into that night, and so people could understand what happened that night and why they, you know, all these years later still suspect, you know, a couple of individuals were withholding information. So it almost became like this is their decision to whether they wanted to go forward. So they gave me a green light, and I was the one who understood the nuances of the case, while others were still reporting like some factual errors and not really understanding, you know, the conflicting statements. And so they opened up to me, and they opened up thousands of pages worth of files. And turns out that all the people that were withholding information back then, even her closest friends, you know, they'd given some statements to the private investigators, but were never speaking to the press in any detail. But with the family's blessing, they're like, well, when I'd call them up, they would say, well, let me check with Charlene to see if it's okay to talk to you. And she gave the green light. Mm-hmm. So that got me talking with her best friends, her college roommates, and then I slowly worked my way forward from there. And I think as I tried to really push the reporting as far as I could, it became I can't give up on this family. I mean, these people were bearing their souls to me and giving me some dark secrets that were painful for them to share and scary for them to put out in the spotlight in this book. So here we are. It's somewhat of a, you know, it's not just telling the story. It's, you know, doing it for a reason. Something that a book could accomplish that a newspaper article can't. It kind of like has a couple days of attention and fades, but a book that actually explains what happened, and you actually get into the heads of the people that were there that night and know why, you know, all these red flags around this young woman and their, you know, party life in this Midwest town. You know, everything about that, it's kind of important to dig into. It becomes more of a universal story to understand what happened that night, and also to put the spotlight on, you know, those persons of interest who, you know, were withholding information. So.
Thank you. And yeah, Phil, this one is for you. Some of the people you spoke to at the UFC about Volkman, one person you spoke with that knew him there said he was foggiest and shadiest. You remember that? Like person describing that. And thinking of that and seeing how all these red flags were raised over time about Volkman, what he was doing, and it seemed like he was just able to bounce around to all these different like hospitals and clinics and other things. Yeah. Do you think that person who described them that way, do you think that was something that kind of piqued your interest and be like, hey, this is an unsavory guy?
So he's talking about, so one of the very first places I started with my reporting, perhaps out of convenience, was, well, at my parents' house, because my dad knew this guy or had known him in college and in medical school, and I asked him, you know, what do you know about him? And so I started to work on a portrait of Volkman as a young man, which draws from interviews with my dad. They were part of a select cohort of MD, PhD students at the University of Chicago. That was another thing that piqued my interest in the case. It wasn't just that Paul Volkman was an MD, he also had a PhD like my dad, and his PhD was in pharmacology, which is the study of medications. So he really, of all people, should have known what he was doing. And so I tracked down their cohort to see, you know, what you mentioned. You know, did anybody see red flags early on, and I describe in an early chapter of the book what I learned from that reporting. And nobody whom I spoke with said, oh, that guy was an absolute walking red flag. That guy, we all thought he was going to wind up in prison. That wasn't the answer I got. In fact, one person said, who was not a med school classmate but knew him at the time, I thought one day I would open the paper and see that Paul had been given the Nobel Prize. So he struck people as quite bright, even if he was a bit arrogant, a bit cynical. Certainly people noticed that he didn't have the best people skills, which would be a recurring theme throughout his career. And over time, I mean, from there, I was able to, the first section of the book, there's 5 sections in the book, details his career up to the point when he begins working in Ohio. And I try to retrace his steps, including digging into these multiple malpractice cases that he says were unscrupulous lawyers and patients who were out to make a buck, and a system that's tilted against doctors for malpractice. And, that was plausible enough. I mean, he isn't the first doctor to say that the civil jury system isn't favorable to doctors, but I wanted to see what I could learn independently. And so over that time, during it, and it turns out there is a lot more to these stories than he let on. There were 2 jury verdicts against him in these civil cases, and there were 2 additional settlements. And there was even a 5th case that didn't pick up any traction because he filed for bankruptcy. So over time, I did see some patterns that emerged a bit more clearly, even if those patterns weren't visible in his med school years. I think as his career went on, there were some flags and there were some attempts at accountability. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request, for instance, with the state of Illinois for a complaint that their Department of Professional Regulation made against him after one of the cases that turned into a malpractice lawsuit involving a severe and rapid onset illness of a 1-year-old child who was in his pediatrics office who wound up dying a few days later. And the Board of Professional Regulation called it reckless, dangerous. They sought to have his license suspended or revoked. Somehow, and this is one of the answers I unfortunately couldn't get an answer to, he fought those charges off. This was in the late 80s, and was able to keep practicing in Illinois and elsewhere. But I think one of the ways, and the last thing I'll say, he did evade maybe tripping more alarm bells is at a certain point, even though he was living in Chicago, he had been working in emergency rooms in Chicago. He started taking what are known as locum tenens jobs, temp work for doctors at various hospitals around the Midwest. So this was a guy who was always a solo practitioner in his pediatrics practice, but was also hopping around a lot for temporary gigs. So I think if he did leave a sour taste in people's mouth, or if he left a bit of a legal civil malpractice trail, there wasn't enough in one place for people to really start to put a more compelling picture together. Although I've also heard that state medical boards tend to be the last kind of folks at the crime scene, so to speak, and it often takes not just malpractice lawsuits, but criminal charges to really bring a dangerous doctor down. And that was the case here. It wasn't a medical board that took him down, it was the DEA.
I have questions for both of you. It seems like one of the recurring themes in both of your books is institutions and failing, people in various ways. And as in the course of your reporting for this book, I mean, was there any obviously a difficulty, but there any glaring, hey, this is pretty messed up. You guys should, look into this. Were there any times when those institutions, you just saw this glaring failures and lack of action? You gonna fight over this one?
What's that? Yeah? All right.
Well, you go, or I have something that I could say.
All right, well, institutions would be the police department, the university. When this girl went missing, attractive young woman, blonde, white, from a well-off family. within days, you had big crowds of reporters gathering at the police station, rows of cameras, and Kim Kardashian tweeting out about it, like find Lauren. So it was the spotlight on this small town police department, and they were extremely careful in their words. They did not want to directly point fingers. They treated it more like a missing persons case. They were out to protect the reputation of students, protect the school, just very intertwined, the police force and also for the university. So everything became focused on the search and not the actual investigation of what exactly happened that night and where the evidence was. The police came off as somewhat bumbling, and I could go on and on about that. So all the attention that was brought to bear, the police were still very careful in going at the boys who were with her that night, say, who got really high-powered lawyers for this case. So there was certainly an interesting dynamic in a campus setting. It was the institution. I guess the clash came when the family brought in some retired NYPD detectives into town, and you kind of saw the different approach and the aggressiveness from New York. So I guess that's part of the book as well, is how much attention could be brought to bear on a case, and whether it's effective investigation versus just kind of hollow attention.
So, I mean, certainly the backdrop of my book is the opiate epidemic. And the opiate epidemic, which is a man-made crisis, is absolutely a story about institutional failures. In fact, there's probably too many institutions to keep track of. Federal agencies, McKinsey Consulting, who is now facing heat for helping Purdue Pharma sell OxyContin. The list goes on, and by the time this book came out, there have been a lot of great books about those institutional failures. And I don't mean to say that there were no institutional failures in this story, but I think that's less of the main takeaway. Volkman, when he was committing his criminal activity, was at these non-hospital affiliated pain clinics that kind of operated in a bit of an oversight black hole. I will say that when it came to my reporting, I found some institutions that were less than forthcoming, shall we say. I mean, there are many reasons this book took 15 years. One of them was that the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, refused to hand over the evidence from Volkman's case that was shown in court in an 8-week trial, which was a bit baffling to me at first, and certainly baffling, even more baffling as years went on. And I had to contact my local ACLU, which helped me file a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. So there, if you go on my Facebook page, there are photos of me standing in front of various courthouses for hearings related to that years-long case. And not to insult this wonderful host city of Chicago, but when I went to look into that case of the infant who had died shortly after that event in Volkman's office, Volkman wasn't the only defendant in that case. In fact, the paramedics who arrived at the scene, who were employees of the city of Chicago, were sued, even though many of the folks I talked to felt that they had just been kind of added on because they had potentially deeper pockets than Volkman had. But this was in the late 1980s, and of course there had been a trial in that case too, a civil trial, which led to a verdict against Volkman. I wanted to get access to those records, the transcripts and the evidence. And when I called up the city of Chicago and asked them, if they knew about this case and if they remembered it, they basically, initially people said yes, but then they said basically it was still too sensitive. They didn't feel comfortable sharing this information with me for a proceeding that had happened in open court 30 years ago. And that was frustrating. So it wasn't their fault that this had happened, but time and again in this reporting, and I'm sure with Shawn as well, you run into institutions that are not so happy to see a reporter show up with their notebook and a tape recorder and say, what happened here?
Yeah, and in my case, police would act like it was an achievement to announce how many tips came in. And it's comical in retrospect, the stuff that was actually released from the department.
Okay, since we have a few minutes left, I was kind of it'll be another both of you answer type of question. So, three things we say up here is being journalists at various points. And I feel like as journalists, most people like general public doesn't realize that investigative journalism is expensive. And that's why you have ProPublica and these others. But you all.
That's why you should buy our books. Sorry, that slipped out.
It's you guys' show, so it's okay. And yeah, so basically, what do you say to folks who don't understand, like, hey, like, there's a lot of manpower and effort to produce content like this, and the same day to the masses? What do you think folks should know?
So at one point before the ACLU of Rhode Island got involved, Rhode Island's where I live, which is why they helped me sue. I wrote an op-ed, maybe an ill-advised op-ed, in the small paper of Portsmouth, Ohio, where the crimes had taken place, basically asking where the evidence was from this case that had happened. And a guy who I previously interviewed wrote a response in the same paper, basically accusing me of being in cahoots with Volkman, and also saying that I seemed to be in this for the money. To which I would say, what I said to him is like, you don't get into this for the money, because if this is a I was going to say get rich quick scheme, it's certainly not that. It's 15 years, and it's just now a product you can buy, but it's also not a get rich scheme either. But what I also said to him was that if you're going to accuse me of being out this to make money, you would need to do the same for the CBS, which came to town and do reports, and they run their news with ad breaks in between. Men's Health Magazine, which came and reported on Portsmouth, which also runs with advertisements. Even NPR, which comes to town and reports on the opiate epidemic and has pledge drives. So I don't know where people got this idea that journalism is this thing that just kind of falls into readers' laps. I mean, maybe the internet probably didn't help because they got it for free. And I certainly love doing public service journalism. I wrote for a free newspaper back in Rhode Island, an all-weekly, and I loved the fact that it was a free paper, and that it was written in language that was widely accessible for everyone to understand. But yes, even I didn't know going into this how much expense was involved in writing a true crime book. I mean, just court records alone are surprisingly expensive. There's a memorable Boston.com headline from when the Boston bomber trial was happening, the younger brother, and it said you could buy the transcript from the case or you could buy a Range Rover. So there's just costs at every step of the way that were even invisible to me, gas, lodging, food, and that's before you even get to things like court records. So yeah, it's not a cheap thing to do. But I felt for so many reasons, including, as you said, the sense of purpose once I started to interview the family members of people who had lost their lives, I just didn't feel I could ever give it up. And I had support from my family also, for which I'm very grateful. But yeah, true crime is not cheap.
And I guess I'd almost go outside my book a little bit here. I've been a journalist forever. Maybe 15 years ago, I actually had a newsroom, and they had actually send me places, and rather than just working the phones. And today, flash forward, I'm currently my day job is I'm on a national reporter on the exclusives team for the Daily Mail, and they fly me around the country even to just knock on a door. And today's media. It could be a story that everyone's reading about, and I actually fly to town and start working it, and there's no national media actually at the locations. They're writing it remotely, so everyone's just kind of retreated in the industry. So I think I'm fortunate that almost my entire career I've had drawn an annual salary from places that I work for, because I certainly as far as this book is concerned, I worked on it over the course of like 5 years. There's no way I could have done it without a day job. That would have been foolish.
And if I could just add one more thing, one context of this book, crimes that took place between 2003 and 2006, a trial that took place in 2011, is the opiate epidemic. But somewhat more subtly is that this is a book that takes place in an era of the retreat of the press you're talking about. And specifically, I would point to the 8-week trial in Cincinnati, which, when I finally got my hands on the transcript, felt kind of like uncovered territory. There is a certain era, if that trial had taken place in the 80s or 90s, you would imagine newspaper dispatches probably from every day or multiple days of that trial, but there was really nothing on the wires or in newspapers except to mark the beginning of the trial, the end, and the sentencing. So one thing I was able to do, I mean, it's kind of exciting as a reporter, but also a bit unsettling. It's like, there's a really interesting conversation and debate that took place in this courtroom about the boundaries of medicine during the opiate epidemic, and it really hadn't been covered in anything except for a cursory way up to this point. So I include multiple chapters taking readers inside that courtroom because I feel like it's an important conversation.
Gotcha. I know we got a few minutes, and we've been talking about some things that are pretty heavy, so I'll just end on a happy note. Shawn, Pub Day is coming for you, and Philip, you had yours. Starting over with Philip, what did you do on Pub Day?
What did I do on Pub Day? Well, my partner and I went to some local bookstores and signed some books, which was very Oh, Pub Day was April 9th. Oh, what is Publication Day? Yeah, Publication Day. So I went to some bookstores and signed some books, and I had a launch day event at one of my favorite bookstores in my hometown. I referred to my 2 Providence bookstore events where I've lived pretty much my whole life as home games before I went on the road, and they were really well attended, and people from multiple times in parts of my life. Unexpectedly, Rhode Island's a small place. A local state rep came and handed me like a formal citation, which was completely unexpected. There was a typo of my name in the book, but whatever. I'm still going to hang it on my office wall. It was just an incredible day that despite, I always want to keep an eye on the fact that it is really dark subject matter, but to have people be able to see and respond to and listen to, if they're audio people, this story that I had been living with and working on privately for so long, to finally have it be out in the world, it's hard to express how gratifying that has been.
And yours is coming up. Any ideas what you want to do?
This is kind of like a strange feeling for me because I have friends and family and others who are saying congratulations that the book's coming out, and I cringe at that because for me the book coming out is it doesn't mean much, It's wanting people to read it and to care and start talking about the case again. So this is not a vanity project, and I consider it a failure if it doesn't do, actually get people talking about the case again. So I've had friends who've launched books, and I've been in bookstores, and they buy their wine and stuff, and it's nice, and they read from the book, and it feels really good. My personality, I'm uncomfortable with that.
Okay, and thanks for you two for talking about the book, and you folks for listening, and I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys appreciate it.